There is a picture most of us carry somewhere in the back of our minds when we hear the words medieval peasant. It arrives almost automatically like a reflex. A hunched figure in rough cloth, bent over a wooden bowl, eating something grey. Something thin, something barely worth the name of food. The bowl might contain gruel, or it might contain something that only resembles gruel because the imagination hasn't bothered to furnish it with anything more interesting. The bread, if there is any, is dark and hard and probably suspect. The whole scene is dim, cold and joyless, and the person eating looks as though they know it. That picture has been painted so many times, in so many books and films and half-remembered school lessons, that it feels almost documentary, like something we collectively witnessed, rather than something collectively imagined. But here is a question worth asking tonight, quietly, without any rush. Where did that picture actually come from? And how much of it holds up when you push gently against it? Before we go any further, take a moment. Where are you right now listening to this? What time is it where you are? Whether it's deep night and the house has gone quiet around you, or early morning with the day not quite started, or somewhere in the grey middle of an afternoon when you needed something slow and thoughtful to accompany you, I'd genuinely love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me what time it is and where in the world you're listening from tonight. There's something that feels right about that, given what we're exploring, the idea that people in entirely different places and conditions have always sat down to eat, have always found ways to feed themselves and the people around them, and have always understood food as something more than fuel. That's a thread that runs through all of us, across all the centuries. Now, back to the grey gruel and the hunched figure. The honest answer is that the stereotype isn't entirely invented. Famine was real. Poverty was real. There were years when harvests failed and people went genuinely hungry, and there were households at the very bottom of the rural hierarchy for whom the margin between eating and not eating was terrifyingly thin. That part of the story is true, and we'll sit with it properly later, because it deserves honesty rather than cheerful dismissal. But the mistake, the one that seems to have taken hold so firmly in popular imagination, is treating the worst moments as the whole story, taking famine years and the diets of the destitute and spreading them across every peasant in every region, across every season of roughly 5 centuries of medieval European life, as if they were all the same person, eating the same bowl of nothing every single day from birth until an early death. That's not history. That's a single brushstroke applied to an enormous canvas. What historians, archaeologists, and the painstaking analysis of manorial records, dietary surveys, monastic accounts, and plant material preserved in the soil of old refuse pits have slowly revealed is something considerably more textured, more seasonal, more regional, more varied in both its pleasures and its cruelties than the stereotype allows for. What ordinary rural people actually ate day to day depended on an almost bewildering number of factors. The time of year mattered enormously in ways that modern food systems have largely erased from daily awareness. The region mattered because a peasant farming the grain fields of southern England lived and ate quite differently from one tending vines in the Languedoc, or keeping cattle on the heavier soils of northern France, or surviving the shorter growing seasons further north and east. Status mattered, because the difference between a free tenant farmer with a modest holding, a customary villan tied more tightly to the demands of the manor, and a landless labourer working for daily wages, was reflected very directly in what ended up in the pot. Access to land mattered. Access to woodland, water, common grazing, and the seasonal rights that came with them mattered. Even the labour demands of a particular season mattered, because a body doing heavy work in harvest time was fed differently, and needed to be, than one resting through the slower rhythms of midwinter. What we're going to find as the year unfolds in the chapters ahead is a story with 2 faces, and both of them are genuine. There is more variety in the medieval peasant diet than the stereotype suggests. There are flavours, textures, and a kind of quiet sophistication to the seasonal management of food that deserves real attention. But there is also more hardship, more uncertainty, and more precariousness than any romantic revisionism would have us believe. The truth lives somewhere in the middle of both of those things, in the ordinary days that were neither a feast nor a famine, in the practical knowledge built up over generations about how to keep a household fed through a full turning year. That's the story we're here for tonight. Not a myth, not a fantasy. Something closer, hopefully, to the real thing. Let's begin. Before we can talk honestly about what medieval peasants ate, we have to spend a moment on a question that sounds almost too simple to be worth asking. Who exactly were they? The word peasant gets used as though it describes a single coherent category of person, a type, a social uniform worn by everyone who wasn't a knight, or a lord, or a bishop. And there's a loose truth in that, the same way there's a loose truth in saying that everyone who works in an office does roughly the same kind of work. Technically, it covers the territory. Practically, it flattens almost everything that matters. Medieval rural society, across the centuries and regions we're exploring tonight, was layered in ways that shaped daily life and daily eating in very direct and practical terms. So it's worth slowing down here, not to drown in the technical vocabulary of medieval social hierarchy, but because understanding even the broad outlines of who was who helps explain why two people we might casually call peasants, living within a few miles of each other, might have eaten quite differently. At one end of the spectrum you had free tenants, sometimes called freeholders, people who held land from a lord under relatively favourable terms, paying rent in money or kind rather than owing large amounts of labour service, and who had more legal freedom to move, to sell their rights, to make decisions about what they grew and kept. Free tenure came in many varieties, and its precise meaning shifted depending on region and period. But the key point for our purposes is this. A free tenant with a decent-sized holding had significantly more control over what happened on that holding than someone lower in the hierarchy. What they grew, what they could keep, what they could sell at market, all of this was considerably less constrained. Below them, or alongside them, depending on how a particular manor was organised, sat the unfree peasants, often called serfs in general terms. Though the actual terminology in medieval sources was far more varied, villeins in England, serfs proper in much of France, various regional equivalents elsewhere. Their situation was legally and economically quite different. They were bound to the land in ways that limited their freedom of movement, and they owed substantial labour obligations to their lord, working on the lord's land for a set number of days per week or per season before they could turn to their own. This wasn't slavery in the ancient sense, but it wasn't freedom either, and the practical consequences were real. Days spent labouring on the demesne, the lord's home farm, were days not spent tending your own plot, your own garden, your own animals. Time is a form of wealth, and serfs had less of it to spend on their own behalf. Then there were the cotters, or cottagers, a group that gets less attention than it deserves. These were households with very small holdings, often just a cottage with a garden plot attached, sometimes barely that. A cotter might have a small strip or two in the open fields, a garden and perhaps a pig, a few hens, rights to gather fuel and forage from common land, and very little else in terms of land resources. They often supplemented what they could grow with wage labour for wealthier neighbours or the lord's farm, and their diet sat closer to the edge of sufficiency than that of a more comfortably established villein with a full or half-yard land holding. And at the very bottom, though they're sometimes overlooked in broad surveys of peasant life, were the truly landless, labourers who owned no land at all, or none worth speaking of, and who depended almost entirely on wages and whatever could be gathered, gleaned, or received as part of their payment for work. The right to glean, to follow behind the harvest and collect what the reapers left behind, was recognised in medieval custom as a genuine resource, and it mattered to people for whom those fallen grains represented a real part of the year's food supply. But gleaning and wage labour provided a much thinner and less reliable foundation than even a modest holding with its garden and field strips. Now, here's where it gets interesting for our purposes, because the difference between all of these categories wasn't primarily one of labels. It was one of access. Access to land, first and most obviously, because land was where food came from, whether as grain from open field strips, vegetables from a garden plot, or pasture for animals. But access to the commons mattered almost as much, and this is something the broad popular image of medieval peasant life tends to miss entirely. Common rights, the legal and customary entitlement to use shared resources, were an enormously significant part of how rural households fed themselves. The right to graze animals on common pasture meant that a family with no enclosed private meadow could still keep a cow or a small flock of sheep, animals that provided milk, cheese, butter, wool, and eventually meat, all of which shaped the diet in concrete ways. The right to gather fuel and forage from woodland, to collect nuts and berries and perhaps hunt small game where that was permitted, to cut peat or bracken from common waste ground, all of these things represented real food and fuel that didn't have to be purchased or produced from a family's own land alone. A cotter with secure common rights was in a meaningfully different position from a cotter without them, even if they held the same amount of private ground. Household size wove through all of this as well. A couple with young children and a full yardland holding might eat quite well, because the labour available to work, the land matched the land they had. A household with many mouths to feed from the same holding, or one that had lost a working adult to illness or death, faced a different arithmetic entirely, and obligations to lords, whether in labour, grain renders, or money rents, could take a significant slice out of what a household produced before the family ate a bite of it. When we imagine a family sitting down to their pottage, it's worth remembering that the grain in the pot represents what remained after those obligations had been met, not the full yield of everything they grew. There is one more thing worth saying here, and it's perhaps the most important corrective to the idea of the medieval peasant as a fixed singular type. The medieval period was not a moment. It was roughly 5 centuries of continuous change across dozens of regions, languages, political systems and climates. The peasant of the year 900 in a Frankish village, and the peasant of the year 1400 in an English market town, lived in worlds that had shifted enormously from one another, often in ways that affected food directly. The expansion of markets over the central medieval centuries changed what could be bought and sold. The Black Death of the mid-14th century, devastating as it was, dramatically altered the balance of power between lords and labourers in its aftermath, leaving the survivors with more bargaining leverage, higher wages in some cases, and in some regions access to more and better food than their grandparents had known. Legal conditions shifted. Some serfs or their descendants eventually negotiated freer conditions. Some formerly free peasants found their status slipping as economic conditions changed around them. The opening of new land through clearing and drainage in some periods gave some families access to holdings they couldn't have had before. The closing of that frontier in others squeezed households onto plots too small to support them comfortably. What this means practically is that when we talk tonight about what medieval peasants ate, we are really talking about a range of possible diets distributed across an enormous span of time and space and social conditions, with real patterns running through them, things that do hold broadly true, but with genuine variation underneath. The free tenant with a solid holding, a cow, a pig, secure common rights, and a good garden in a prosperous English village of the 13th century ate rather better, on average, than a landless labourer scraping through a difficult decade after crop failures in a region that had already been under pressure for a generation. Both of them, in common usage, get called peasants. Keeping that range in mind, that span of conditions and centuries and possibilities, is what allows us to be honest about both sides of the story. The places where the diet was richer and more varied than the stereotype suggests, and the places where it genuinely wasn't. The households that managed real sufficiency, and even modest comfort through most years, and the households that couldn't. Both existed. Both are part of the same history. And it is into this layered, complicated, stubbornly human world, not into some monolithic grey mass of undifferentiated poverty, that we now follow one ordinary household on an ordinary day to see what was actually simmering in the pot. So how do we actually know any of this? That's a question worth pausing on honestly, because the answer shapes everything else we'll cover tonight, and it's more complicated and more interesting than it might first appear. The obvious starting point is written records, and medieval Europe did produce a substantial body of them. Manorial accounts, compiled by estate administrators on behalf of lords, recorded in sometimes remarkable detail what was grown on the demesnes, what was stored in the granary, how much was allocated to workers as part of their wages, what was sold at market, and what was consumed in the lord's household. Household accounts from wealthier establishments, monastic records laying out what was to be eaten on which days, and in what quantities, court cases and legal documents in which disputes over food renders or market transactions left traces of what ordinary people bought and sold and ate. All of these form a layer of the historical record that genuinely tells us something real about food in the medieval countryside. These sources have their uses. They are specific. They mention quantities. They name things. A 13th century manorial account that records a certain number of bushels of peas distributed to harvest workers, or a monastic rule specifying the daily bread ration for lay brothers, or a court record noting that a villager owed his lord a certain number of hens or eggs as part of his annual render. These are concrete details, and they accumulate into a picture. But here is where we have to be careful, and this is one of the genuine challenges of this particular history. Almost all of the written records from the medieval period were produced by or for the literate classes, which in practice meant clergy, wealthy landowners, estate administrators, and occasionally merchants. The peasant household itself left almost no written record in its own words, because the great majority of rural people could not write, and even if they could, the materials and circumstances for keeping written accounts simply weren't part of ordinary domestic life. What we have then is largely a record of peasant life as seen from above, what lords required of their tenants, what estates consumed, what church institutions prescribed. This is valuable, but it needs to be read carefully, because it can distort as easily as it illuminates. A manorial account tells you what a lord allocated to his workers on harvest days. It doesn't necessarily tell you what those workers ate at home on an ordinary Tuesday in February, when no lord's clerk was keeping records and no formal distribution was happening. A monastic rule lays out what monks were supposed to eat, carefully calibrated to church teaching, liturgical season, and ideals of discipline and self-denial. It doesn't tell us how closely those rules matched practice, and it tells us very little about the secular peasant household a few miles down the road. Elite-authored texts sometimes describe peasant food in ways shaped more by aristocratic contempt, moralizing, or literary convention than by careful observation. The image of peasants eating coarse bread and thin gruel appears partly because that's what wealthy writers sometimes said peasants ate, and it's worth asking how much that reflected reality and how much it reflected what the wealthy expected, assumed, or perhaps wished to believe about the people below them in the social order. This is where archaeology steps in to correct, complicate, and sometimes overturn what the written record seems to say, and it does so through evidence that has no author, no agenda, and no interest in making any particular argument. Excavations of medieval rural settlements have recovered seeds, charred plant remains, and pollen deposits that allow researchers to reconstruct what was actually growing and being processed at a given site. The range of plant species recovered from many English and continental village sites is considerably broader and more varied than the simplest written accounts would suggest. Multiple grain types, peas, beans, leeks, onions, various herbs, both cultivated and wild gathered plants, represented in the botanical record of ordinary village life. This is direct physical evidence of what was present in these households, not what someone with a quill and an agenda chose to write down. Animal bones are similarly revealing. The species represented, the ages at which animals were slaughtered, the cut marks and butchery patterns on the bones, the proportion of different body parts found at a site. All of these details carry information about how animals were used, how meat was distributed and processed, and what the realistic contribution of animal foods to the diet might have been. A site that produces cattle bones predominantly from older animals, for example, suggests a community that kept cattle primarily for their working and dairy value, and slaughtered them at the end of their useful lives, which in turn suggests that dairy products may have been more economically central than fresh beef. The bones don't say this directly, but they allow careful and reasoned inference. Pottery residue analysis has become one of the more striking archaeological tools in recent decades. By examining the organic compounds absorbed into the walls of cooking vessels over years of use, researchers can sometimes identify what was actually cooked in a pot, detecting the chemical signatures of dairy fats, plant matter, and meat in combinations that give a more concrete sense of what pottage or other dishes might actually have contained. These findings don't yield recipes, and interpretations are sometimes debated and revised as methods develop, but they offer a genuinely new kind of access to the question, reaching past the silence of the written record and into the material reality of the cooking fire itself. Cooking sites and hearth structures add another layer. The physical arrangement of a medieval cottage, its hearth, its storage areas, the location of outbuildings and animal pens, the traces of what was stored and where, all of this speaks to how food was managed and prepared as a continuous daily practice, rather than as something observed from the outside and recorded by a stranger. There are still significant limits, and it's worth being honest about them rather than pretending the picture is clearer than it is. Organic materials don't preserve equally well everywhere. A wet, acidic soil destroys bone and plant matter that might survive for centuries in drier conditions, which means the archaeological record is itself geographically and environmentally uneven, and conclusions drawn from well-excavated English sites don't automatically transfer to, say, southern France or the Iberian Peninsula without additional evidence. Sampling bias matters. The sites that have been excavated most thoroughly aren't necessarily representative of the full range of medieval rural experience. And the interpretation of archaeological evidence requires judgment calls at every stage about what residues mean, what bone assemblages suggest, how botanical remains relate to what was eaten versus what was processed for other purposes. Experimental history and comparative studies have emerged as one way of trying to fill these gaps, not to replace evidence with guesswork, but to test whether proposed interpretations are actually plausible in practice. Historians and archaeologists working with food scientists, nutritionists, and agricultural specialists have attempted to reconstruct medieval diets from the ground up, calculating what a household with a given landholding under typical conditions might realistically have produced, and whether the resulting diet would have provided adequate nutrition. Some of this work has produced genuinely surprising results, suggesting that a household with secure access to land, common rights, a kitchen garden, and even modest animal keeping could, in a reasonable year, manage a diet considerably richer in calories and nutrients than the gruel and misery picture implies. These are models, not certainties, and they depend on assumptions that can be debated, but they provide a useful check on interpretations that rely too heavily on either the rosy or the bleak extreme. Comparative study of pre-industrial societies in other times and places contributes as well, with appropriate caution, agricultural communities in later periods that lived under broadly similar technological conditions, growing similar crops, keeping similar animals, using similar storage and preservation methods, can offer plausible parallels for what medieval peasant foodways might have looked like in practice. This kind of comparison requires care, because history doesn't repeat itself in neat, transferable ways, and conditions that seem similar on the surface can differ in important particulars. But used carefully, it helps historians think through what was practically possible rather than working only from fragments. What emerges from all of this work, the documents and the excavated seeds and the pottery residues and the experimental reconstructions, taken together and read critically, is not a single clear image but something more like a developing photograph. Some areas in sharp focus, some still in flux, some perhaps irretrievably obscured. What it does offer with reasonable confidence is enough to challenge the most persistent assumptions in either direction. The assumption that medieval peasants ate uniformly and miserably, and equally the assumption that their diet was some kind of hidden paradise of wholesome simplicity. The reality sits somewhere more interesting and more specific than either of those stories. And it's into that specific reality that the rest of tonight's exploration moves. Begin with grain, because grain was where it started, not as an abstraction or a category on a nutritionist's chart, but as the literal foundation on which nearly everything else rested. For the majority of medieval peasant households across most of Europe, across most of the centuries we might reasonably call medieval, cereal crops provided the dominant share of daily calories. This is not the myth. This part, at least, the popular imagination gets roughly right. What it gets wrong is almost everything else about it. The first thing to understand is that wheat, the grain most modern Europeans and North Americans associate instinctively with bread, was not the grain most medieval peasants were eating, at least not most of them, most of the time. Wheat was demanding. It required better soil, more careful tending, and more favourable conditions than some of its alternatives, and it commanded higher prices at market and higher rents in kind from those who grew it. In many regions and many centuries, wheat was primarily a cash crop, something grown to sell, to pay obligations, to appear on the tables of manor houses and monastic refectories and town bakers, serving wealthier customers. The peasant who grew it might rarely taste it. What they were more likely eating depended considerably on where they lived. Rye was perhaps the most widespread grain of the peasant table across much of northern and central Europe, hardier than wheat, more tolerant of cold and poor soil, producing a dense, dark, somewhat sour bread with a tight crumb and a keeping quality that actually exceeded wheat bread in many conditions. A loaf of rye bread, properly made, could remain edible for considerably longer than a wheat loaf, which mattered enormously in a household where baking didn't happen every day. Barley was equally significant in many regions, though it behaves differently, lower in the gluten that gives wheat and rye their structure. Barley bread tends toward the crumbly and flat, rather than the tall and springy, but barley was also the grain most important for brewing, which, as we'll explore later, made it doubly valuable. Oats, particularly in Scotland, Ireland, parts of northern England, and Scandinavia, occupied a central place that they didn't hold quite as firmly further south, partly because oats thrived in the wet, cool conditions of the Atlantic fringe, where other grains struggled. And then there was maslin, a word that appears in period sources and refers not to a specific grain, but to a deliberate mixture, typically wheat and rye sown and harvested together, hedging against the possibility that one or the other might fail in a given year. Maslin bread was, for many households, probably the closest thing to an everyday standard, not purely the prestigious wheat, not purely the robust but demanding rye, but a practical blend that balanced the qualities of both. Bread quality, though, was not determined by grain alone, and this is where the picture becomes considerably more textured. The degree to which grain was bolted, meaning sifted after milling to remove bran and produce a finer, lighter flour, determined the colour and texture of the resulting bread. The whitest, finest bread required the most thorough bolting and the best milling. It also wasted a significant portion of the grain, since the bran and germ removed in the process were discarded or fed to animals rather than eaten. A household that could afford to bolt its flour to a high degree was demonstrating, in a quite literal sense, that it had surplus grain to spare. For most peasant households, the bread was dark and dense, not because they preferred it that way, or because they didn't know better, but because bolting away the bran meant losing calories they couldn't afford to lose. Whole grain bread wasn't a choice of rustic simplicity. It was a practical calculation. Access to milling added another layer of constraint that shaped the reality of grain consumption in ways the straightforward account of bread doesn't capture. Across most of medieval Europe, grain had to be ground at the lord's mill, the manorial mill that the lord owned and maintained, and that tenants were typically required by custom and law to use, paying a portion of their flour as the miller's fee, which in turn passed to the lord. This arrangement, called mill suit, or suit of mill in English sources, was a genuine economic burden, and millers had a reputation in medieval literature for sharp dealing that probably wasn't entirely undeserved, given the structural temptation to keep a little extra from each customer's grinding. Some households ground grain at home using hand querns, small stone grinding tools, and there's archaeological evidence of their use across rural sites, though lords often tried to prohibit this practice precisely because it allowed tenants to avoid the mill fee. The grain that arrived in a household's storage and the bread that eventually came out of the household's oven had passed through a series of institutional constraints, obligations, and economic negotiations before it reached the table. Beyond bread itself, grain appeared in other forms that were at least as important to daily eating, and possibly more practically central for households that didn't bake frequently. Porridge in its many regional variations, grain cooked in water or sometimes milk until it softened into a thick, sustaining mass, required no oven, no leavening, and far less preparation than bread. It could be made in the same pot over the same hearth used for everything else, and it was considerably more forgiving of variable grain quality than bread, which demands a certain standard of flour and some reliable rising agent to turn out properly. Oat porridge in the north, barley porridge in various forms across much of northern Europe, millet-based preparations further south and east. These weren't side dishes or occasional alternatives. For many households in many periods, they were the meal. And then the pottage, which the next chapter will take up in the detail it deserves, drew on grain as thickener and body, oats or barley added to simmering liquid and vegetables, not as the dish's main identity, but as the element that gave it substance and staying power, turning a broth into something genuinely filling. What this means, taken together, is that the image of medieval peasant grain consumption as simple or monotonous is accurate in the narrow sense that yes, grain was everywhere, and yes, it formed the dominant caloric backbone of most days. But the form it took, the combination of grains used, the degree of processing, the method of preparation, the institutional context of milling and baking access, all of it varied enough across regions, households and seasons to make a single neat picture impossible. The family in a German village eating muslin bread baked once a week, dark and close-textured, was eating something quite different in texture and flavour from the Scots crofter eating oat porridge beside a peat fire, even if both could be fairly described as eating grain at every meal. The grain was the foundation, but what was built on it, and how and for whom, was where the real story lived. We return now to that pot by the hearth, because pottage deserves exactly the kind of patient attention that the word itself rarely receives. In most popular accounts of medieval food, pottage appears briefly, almost apologetically, as shorthand for deprivation, the thin, grey gruel that hungry peasants choked down because they had nothing better. It has become, in a sense, a cliché of medieval misery, a single dreary image that closes off further curiosity rather than opening it. But the cliché is wrong, or at least so incomplete as to be functionally misleading, and understanding why requires looking at what pottage actually was and how it actually worked within the practical reality of a peasant household's day. The word comes from the same root as pot, which is in its way the most honest definition available. Pottage was what went into the pot, not a specific recipe, not a fixed combination of ingredients, but an entire category of cooking organized around a single piece of equipment. The ceramic or iron vessel suspended over or nestled beside the fire that formed the thermal center of nearly every peasant home. The pot was, in many households, going continuously, kept simmering through most of the day and reheated at the start of each new morning, and what it contained on any given day reflected the intersection of what the household had available, what the season was offering, and what had been added or drawn off in the days immediately before. At its leanest in the hardest weeks of a difficult winter, pottage could indeed be thin and plain. Barley or oats, added to water and boiled until they softened and thickened the liquid into something that filled the stomach without offering much else. This is probably the version that gave rise to the Gruel image, and it isn't entirely a fiction. These moments existed, but to take the lean version as the everyday standard is roughly like describing modern English cooking, entirely on the basis of wartime rationing, technically grounded in real historical experience, but badly misrepresenting the ordinary range. In a household with an active kitchen garden and access to even a modest supply of stored provisions, which describes a great many ordinary peasant families across much of the medieval period, pottage was something considerably more varied and more satisfying. Onions and leeks, two of the most reliably cultivated and widely grown vegetables across medieval Europe, went in early, chopped, and left to soften in the simmering liquid until they released their sweetness and gave the whole pot a depth that grain and water alone could never produce. Garlic went in too in households and regions where it was grown, adding a sharper, more assertive note. Dried peas and beans, soaked overnight to begin softening, could be added in the morning and left to break down through the hours of the day, thickening the pot and contributing something close to what we'd now recognize as protein, making the dish genuinely sustaining in a way that a pure grain porridge wasn't quite. Cabbage leaves, pulled from the garden or from a stored winter head, went in toward the end, cooking just enough to soften without entirely losing their body. And herbs, whatever the garden offered and the season allowed, were folded in throughout. Parsley, sage, hyssop, and savoury appear repeatedly in period sources, and there's good reason to think that peasant gardens maintained at least a few of these without any formal record of the fact, since herbs were among the lowest maintenance and most rewarding plants a small plot could contain. Then there was what we might call the seasoning layer, the element that could shift the character of the dish most dramatically without requiring large quantities of anything expensive. A small piece of bacon, a bit of salted pork, a bone with some meat still clinging to it. These weren't always available, and when they weren't necessarily added in quantities that would make the pottage what we'd recognize as a meat dish. But a small amount of animal fat, melting slowly into simmering vegetables and grain, transformed the flavour of the whole pot in a way that's genuinely difficult to overstate. It provided richness, savouriness, and a kind of satisfaction that pure vegetable preparations, however well made, don't quite replicate. Rendered fat skimmed from previous cooking, a small piece of cheese stirred in near the end, even a handful of dried herbs added fresh each day. All of these were adjustments available to a reasonably equipped household that could keep the pot interesting across the days of the week without requiring anything that could reasonably be called luxury. The continuous pot had real practical logic behind it, beyond flavour alone. Fuel was not unlimited. Wood had to be gathered, cut, or purchased, and keeping a fire burning at full intensity to cook a full meal from scratch twice a day was more expensive in both labour and material than maintaining a slow, sustained heat that kept a single vessel simmering throughout. The pottage model suited this perfectly. It asked for consistent low heat rather than repeated high heat, which meant the fire could be managed more gently and more economically, without any sacrifice to the ongoing meal. This mattered in a household where every calculation about resources was a real one. It also suited the rhythm of agricultural labour in a way that any cook who has tried to time a meal around unpredictable work hours will immediately recognise. When the household's adults were out in the fields from first light, the question of when exactly they would return was not always answerable in advance. A pot that could sit, be left to tick over slowly, drawn from when people arrived hungry and cold, and then replenished and kept going until the next meal, was infinitely more practical than anything requiring precise timing. There was no standing by the fire waiting for something to be ready at a particular moment. The pottage was always more or less ready. What this means, put together, is that pottage was less a single dish than an ongoing process, one that a thoughtful household managed continuously, adjusting it across days as ingredients became available, as seasons shifted, as the particular needs and constraints of a given week made themselves felt. The flavour on Monday, with fresh leeks and the remains of Sunday's small piece of bacon, still enriching the liquid, was genuinely different from the flavour on Thursday, when the dried peas had broken down into a thick, almost creamy base, and a handful of new herbs had been added from the garden that morning. Neither version was the real pottage. Both were. Archaeology supports this picture quietly but persistently. Cooking vessels recovered from medieval rural sites show the kind of heavy, layered residue build-up consistent with long and repeated use, not with single-purpose cooking episodes. Charred plant remains from rural contexts reveal genuinely varied botanical profiles. Barley, oats, peas, beans, onions, and numerous herbs appearing together at the same sites, consistent with the layered, continuously evolving dish the historical sources suggest rather than a single grain boiled in water and nothing else. The cliché of pottage as punishment for poverty has survived because it fits a story people already believe about the medieval past. But the evidence points somewhere more interesting, toward a dish that was flexible enough to accommodate whatever a household had, sophisticated enough to reward good management, and practical enough to anchor the eating life of a family through the full turning of a year. If pottage was the method, then the garden was the source, and this is the part of the story that often slides quietly out of view. Popular images of medieval peasants tend to show them out in the open fields, bent over strips of grain or trudging behind a plough, and that work was real and important. But for day-to-day eating, the small plots closest to the house, the kitchen garden, the little enclosures tucked behind cottages or along boundaries were just as vital, and sometimes more so. These gardens were not ornamental spaces. They were working laboratories of survival, constantly adjusted and experimented with, and in many cases overseen primarily by women. A family might not own much land in the open fields, or might hold it only in scattered strips, subject to manorial rules and communal decisions. The garden, by contrast, was more immediately theirs to manage. Within whatever constraints local law imposed, they chose what to plant, where to plant it, when to thin and harvest. Over years, the knowledge of which corner stayed a little damper in drought, which bed caught late frost, which variety of cabbage survived winter best, accumulated into something like a private science. Certain plants are so consistently present in the archaeological and documentary record that they form almost a backbone of this garden world. Cabbage, in its medieval forms, often harder, looser leafed, and more variable than the tightly headed modern supermarket version appears again and again. It was tough, tolerant of poor soils, and astonishingly adaptable, eaten fresh in season, simmered into pottage, or stored as whole heads in cool, dark places for as long as they would keep. Onions and leeks, which we saw slipping into the pot at the start of the day, were also major garden staples. They offered not just bulk, but flavour, one of the few ways an ordinary household could reliably make simple ingredients taste richer and more complex. Root vegetables rounded out the picture. Medieval turnips and parsnips were not always identical to their modern descendants. Some varieties were woodier, some more strongly flavoured, but they shared the same crucial advantage. They stored well, pulled in late autumn, and kept in Clamp's shallow pits, lined with straw and covered with earth, or stored under layers of straw in sheds or cellars. They could be pulled out weeks or months later, a tangible bridge between the generosity of harvest and the scarcity of late winter. Carrots, where they appear, were often pale, yellow or white rather than the standardized orange of later breeding, but they played a similar role. These roots might be eaten roasted when fuel allowed, boiled on their own, or more commonly, cut and dropped straight into the ever-ready pot. It is in this context that beans and peas start to look less like side dishes and more like quiet structural supports of the medieval diet. Grain was the caloric foundation, but for many households across Europe, dried legumes were a primary, and sometimes the primary, source of protein. Field peas and various kinds of beans, some of them quite different from the New World varieties, people might picture today could be eaten green in summer when the pods were young and tender, and then left to mature and dry on the plant for long-term storage. Once dried, they kept for months, sometimes longer, stacked in sacks or stored in jars, waiting for the days when fresh food was scarce. When soaked and simmered, these peas and beans thickened pottage into something approaching what a modern nutritionist might recognize as a balanced meal. Complex carbohydrates from the grain, protein and additional fibre from the legumes, vitamins from the vegetables and herbs layered in. In some regions and periods, combinations of grain and beans were so standard that they formed named dishes of their own, echoing something very close to the protein-complete pairings that now appear in dietary advice. For a peasant family that rarely saw meat in quantity, this mattered. Preservation, once again, was not an afterthought, but a constant preoccupation. Drying was the simplest and most widespread method. Peas and beans could be spread on cloths or flat baskets in sunny, breezy weather, then brought in at night, their moisture slowly driven off until they rattled when shaken. Some leafy vegetables and herbs might be hung in bunches or laid on racks to dry as well, shrinking into brittle, intensely flavoured fragments that could be crumbled into winter dishes. Cabbage leaves could be blanched and then dried in some traditions, or, in certain regions, fermented in ways that anticipate later sauerkraut, though the exact methods and prevalence varied. Root crops, as mentioned, were preserved physically rather than chemically, protected from frost and rot by earth, straw, and careful placement. A well-managed clamp of turnips or parsnips might see a family through the worst weeks of early spring, when the previous year's grain had to be stretched and the new year's growth was still only a green haze in the garden. Onions were braided into ropes and hung from roof beams, both out of the way of mice and in the warmer, drier air that would keep them from sprouting too early. Leeks, hardy and durable, might simply be left in the ground and pulled as needed through much of a mild winter. All of this adds up to a plant world that was far more varied than the grey, single-note picture often painted of medieval peasant food. Part of the reason that misconception persists is that many of the plants most important to ordinary households are so ordinary that elite sources barely mention them. Courtly recipe collections linger over rare spices, imported fruits, and elaborate preparations because those were the things worth boasting about. Nobody in a noble household thought to record, in loving detail, the daily pulling of leeks or the careful storage of turnips. Archaeology, with its charred seeds and soil samples, has had to do much of the work of restoring those ingredients to view. When you put the pieces together, the constant tending of small plots, the rotation of crops through the year, the drying, braiding and burying of harvests, a different medieval landscape comes into focus. Not a world where peasants survived on a monochrome slurry ladled from a pot, but one in which a surprisingly wide range of plants moved through that pot and onto the table over the course of a year. The constraints were real, and the risks of failure never disappeared. But within those constraints, medieval peasant households coaxed a genuine diversity of food out of small spaces, turning gardens, field margins, and bits of common land into a living pantry that sustained them between the great milestones of sowing and harvest. If the garden supplied the bulk of the household's plant food, then the animals kept close to that same cottage added a quieter but no less important layer to the diet. And here it helps to set aside the modern assumption that animal food equals slabs of meat. For many medieval peasants, the most reliable nutrition their animals offered came not from killing them, but from what those animals produced while still very much alive: milk, and with it butter and cheese, eggs, and more indirectly manure for the fields that kept everything else going. Start with milk, because it sits at the centre of this web. A household that owned even a single milk-producing animal, a cow if they were relatively fortunate, more commonly a goat, or in some regions sheep, suddenly had options that a family without such livestock simply did not. Fresh milk could be drunk, especially by children or the elderly, and used in cooking when it was available. But medieval people were acutely aware of how fleeting that freshness was. Without refrigeration, milk turned quickly, especially in warmer months, and so the everyday logic of the cottage pushed in one direction: transform it into something more stable as soon as possible. That is where buttermilk and whey enter the picture, because in a peasant household these liquids were not waste. When cream was skimmed from resting milk and then churned until butter formed, the thinner liquid left behind buttermilk remained drinkable for longer than sweet milk and carried a modest but real nutritional value: some protein, some fat, and the dissolved lactose and minerals from the original milk. It was sourer, especially as it aged, but that sourness was familiar rather than off-putting, folded into people's expectations of what milk could be. Similarly, when milk was curdled and the solid curds pressed and salted to make cheese, the leftover whey was not poured away casually. It could be drunk, given to children, mixed into pottage for a tangy richness, or redirected to pigs and other animals as feed. Modern recipes might treat whey as a byproduct. In a medieval cottage it was simply another part of the spectrum of usable liquids, less glamorous than cream perhaps, but part of the same economy of care in which very little was allowed to be truly wasted. Butter, when it could be made, served a double role. It was, in the most obvious sense, a concentrated store of fat, and fat was precious. It made bread more satisfying, vegetables more filling, and pottage more luxurious. A small pat of butter stirred into a pot, or spread thinly on a piece of coarse bread, altered not just flavour but how long that meal would sustain someone working in the fields. At the same time, butter was one of the few animal products that could, with salting and cool storage, be kept for at least a modest stretch of time. In cooler climates and seasons, a well-salted butter could survive long enough to smooth out the bumps in supply, when the cow was dry or the goat's milk dipped. Cheese, however, was the true workhorse of this system, and in many rural diets across medieval Europe, it arguably mattered more, day to day, than meat. Turning perishable milk into a hard or hardish cheese converted something fragile into something transportable and, crucially, storable. A wheel of cheese represented not just a few days' worth of milk, but months of potential protein and fat, ready to be called on in winter or in a bad harvest year. Harder cheeses, in particular, could be traded or carried to market without falling apart, which tied them into local economies in ways soft, fresh cheeses rarely managed. The cheeses that emerged from peasant cottages were unlikely to be the archetypal fine cheeses that appear in monastic ledgers or urban guild records. They were more often practical, firm, sometimes quite salty, sometimes sharp, their exact flavour depending on the animal, the season, and the skill of the person making them. But their uses were many. A thin slice of cheese with bread could anchor a midday meal in the fields. Crumbled cheese, folded into pottage, brought a welcome richness and extra protein to what might otherwise have been a purely vegetable and grain dish. Small pieces could be cut deliberately thin and shared around a family, stretching what a modern eater might consider a single portion into sustenance for several mouths. The decision of which animals to keep shaped this entire pattern. Cows required more grazing land and more fodder. They were heavier investments, and therefore more strongly associated with households that had slightly better access to resources. Goats, smaller and more adaptable to marginal land, appear in many regions where holdings were modest or terrain was rough. Sheep, when kept not just for wool but also for milk, fed into distinct cheese-making traditions, particularly in upland and pastoral areas. Each animal brought a different quantity and quality of milk, and with it slightly different opportunities for butter and cheese. Eggs sit a little to one side of this dairy world, but belong to the same category of everyday animal food that did not require slaughter. Chickens were widely kept where conditions allowed, scratching around yards and refuse heaps, converting scraps and insects into concentrated portable nutrition. But even here, the rhythm was not simple. Hens do not lay uniformly all year. Laying slowed or stopped in the darker, colder months and picked up again with lengthening days. Households also had to balance eating eggs against the need to hatch new chicks to maintain or grow their flocks. So while eggs could feel abundant in some seasons, boiled, baked into breads and simple cakes in better-off households, or slipped into special pottages in others they were rarer, saved for children, the sick, or occasional treats. What ties all of these animal products together is that they intervened steadily and quietly in meals that might otherwise have been purely plant-based. A bit of cheese grated into a dish, a spoon of butter melting over cooked cabbage, an egg poached in pottage, a cup of buttermilk drunk with coarse bread. These were not extravagant gestures, but they changed the nutritional profile of a meal substantially. Protein and fat, harder to come by in quantity than carbohydrates, arrived in small but regular amounts through these foods. In that sense, for many peasants, cows and goats and chickens mattered at least as much alive as they ever did on the butcher's block. Large servings of meat were rare, often tied to specific occasions, obligations, or windfalls. The daily wealth lay instead in the recurring gifts, the morning milking, the clutch of eggs discovered in straw, the slowly drying cheeses on a shelf. Taken together with the grains and garden produce we have already explored, these quiet contributions from animals turned what might look, from a distance, like a narrow diet into something more resilient and complex than the stereotype of the perpetually starving peasant would suggest. If milk, buttermilk, and whey filled in some of the gaps between bread and pottage, they still did not answer the most basic, unavoidable question of every single day. What did people actually drink, in quantity, from morning to night? This is where we have to pause over one of the most persistent lines in popular writing about the Middle Ages, the claim that people didn't drink water. You may have heard it stated almost as a rule, as though every medieval person turned up their nose at a cup of water and reached for ale instead. The reality looks more complicated, and in many ways more sensible. People absolutely did drink water. Medieval writers mention wells being dug and maintained, springs being valued, disputes arising over access to a good source. Legal records refer to the protection and repair of village wells, which would have been meaningless if no one used them. In places with reliable, clean springs or carefully managed wells, water could be an entirely ordinary part of daily life, especially for those too young, too poor, or too marginal to have regular access to brewed drink. At the same time, medieval people were not naive about the risks. They did not know about bacteria, but they were acutely aware that some water made people ill and other water did not. Texts from physicians to preachers distinguish between good and bad water, praising clear, running sources and warning against stagnant pools or streams fouled by animals and human waste. In dense towns and some villages, where latrines, animals and industry crowded around the same limited watercourses, that caution was more than justified. Into this landscape stepped ale, boiled in the brewing, mildly alcoholic after fermentation, and based on grain, which was already the backbone of the diet. It is not difficult to see why, over time, ale became less a special beverage and more a default liquid food in many communities, because that is one helpful way to think about it, not primarily as a drink in the modern sense of a leisure beverage, but as a liquid extension of bread and porridge. The same barley or oats that might be milled into flour could instead be malted, soaked, germinated just enough to unlock their starches, then dried and crushed to create the base for ale. When boiled with water, this malt produced wort, a sweet cloudy liquid that once cooled and fermented, became ale. For a peasant household, this was work, but it was manageable, recurring work. Brewing slotted into the same domestic cycle as baking and cheese-making. In many parts of medieval Europe, it was women who brewed for the household and sometimes for the broader community. The brewster, as English sources sometimes call her when she brewed on a larger, semi-commercial scale, managed grain, water, fuel for boiling, and the yeast that made the whole enterprise possible. Yeast, again, was part of that quiet continuity that ran through the cottage. It might arrive invisibly on the air, but more often it was shepherded from one batch to the next, the froth scraped from fermenting ale, the dregs left in a barrel, sometimes the same yeast culture that also leavened bread. Just as a piece of yesterday's dough could start tomorrow's loaf, the memory of last week's ale helped bring this week's brew to life. Not all ale was created equal. Medieval sources distinguish quite plainly between stronger and weaker brews. The first runnings from a batch of malt, the wort drawn off when the grain was richest in sugar, produced a stronger, more alcoholic ale. This was valuable. It might be reserved for feast days, guests, or sale, contributing cash or barter value to the household economy. But from the same malt, once the strong wort was drained, the grain could be mashed with fresh hot water again, sometimes more than once, to yield progressively weaker worts. These later runnings produced what is often called small ale or small beer, low in alcohol, lighter in body, but still carrying dissolved nutrients from the grain. Everyday village drink likely leaned heavily on these weaker brews. They were cheaper in terms of grain, less intoxicating, and suitable for steady consumption by adults and children alike over a long working day. Imagine, then, the practical logic. A field worker needs hydration and calories. Clean water, if available, provides the first, but not the second. Ale, especially small ale, offers both. Fluid to drink, plus energy in the form of carbohydrates, some B vitamins, and a bit of protein and minerals. Drunk in mugs or wooden cups with breakfast bread, with the noon meal and again in the evening, it quietly underpinned much of the day's labour. This does not mean rural Europe wandered around in a permanent haze of intoxication. A weak ale, perhaps in the range of what we might compare to a very light modern beer, or even lower spread over long hours and heavy work, did not have the same effect as modern binge drinking, and medieval moralists who complained about drunkenness focused their ire on taverns, feasts, and stronger drinks, not on ordinary household consumption of small ale. There were, of course, alternatives and variations. In wine-growing regions, parts of France, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, wine filled some of the same roles as ale, including in diluted forms for everyday drinking. In areas with abundant, trusted springs, or in poorer or more marginal households that struggled to spare grain for brewing, water must have featured more prominently. Herbal infusions and simple decoctions may also have played a role, though they appear less clearly in the sources for peasants than they do in medical or monastic contexts. What ties all of these choices together is that they were not arbitrary. Drink in a medieval peasant's life sat at the intersection of safety, custom, labour, and local resources. A village with a sweet, reliable spring might rely more on water than one whose wells were suspect. A household with slightly more grain could afford regular brewing. One with tighter margins might brew less often and stretch each batch further. In colder climates and cereal-heavy regions, ale and similar grain-based drinks naturally took on a larger share of the burden. When we picture the table in our cottage now, it helps to see not just the coarse bread, the pottage, and the slice of cheese, but also the cup, sometimes filled with small ale drawn from a household cask, sometimes with water from the well on a good day, sometimes with a mixture of liquids that blurred the categories we neatly separate. In that cup, as much as on the plate, the daily work of staying alive safely, steadily, and with as little waste as possible was carried out, swallow by swallow, year after year. If bread and ale formed the quiet backbone of the diet, meat is the loud guest who keeps barging into modern imagination and insisting it was always the star of the show. In paintings, in fantasy novels, in video games, the peasant table somehow ends up with a roast of something on it far more often than the evidence suggests. But here we have to tread carefully, because sweeping claims in either direction tend to miss the point. Medieval peasants were not living on endless meat, yet they were also not universally trapped in a kind of permanent vegetarianism. How much meat appeared, and in what form, depended intensely on place, period, wealth, and even on how you define meat in the first place. It helps to set aside, at least for a moment, the image of a joint of beef as the default. Cattle were valuable as living machines. They pulled ploughs, hauled carts, and produced manure. Killing an adult cow meant losing that power and that fertilizer. As a result, beef, in many rural contexts, did not appear frequently on ordinary peasant tables. When it did, it was often from an old or injured animal no longer useful for work, or from parts of the animal that elites didn't particularly want, the less glamorous cuts, organs, and offal. The more ordinary meat for many peasants, when they had it, came from smaller animals that were easier to raise, quicker to mature, and less catastrophic to slaughter. Here pigs and poultry stepped to the front. Pigs were, in many regions, the peasant's most practical walking larder. They could be turned out into woods and commons, fed on scraps and acorns, fattened with relatively modest inputs compared to cattle. Their bodies, once slaughtered, lent themselves well to preservation. Salting, smoking, turning into bacon and sausages that could flavour pottage through winter. Archaeological remains from rural settlements in parts of northern Europe show significant pig bones, suggesting that pork, in some places and times, played a regular if carefully managed role in peasant diets. But regular might not mean what a modern listener assumes. For some households, a pig might be slaughtered once a year, or only some years. Its meat preserved and stretched as far as possible. A chunk might be boiled for a feast or special Sunday, but more often, fat and small bits of meat found their way into that perpetual pot, or into a pan with onions and cabbage, turning vegetables and grain into something richer. In leaner villages, even that annual pig might have been an aspiration rather than a guarantee. Poultry occupied a somewhat different niche. Chickens, and in some regions ducks or geese, could forage around the yard, eating insects, scraps, and spilled grain. They paid their rent not so much in meat as in eggs, which fit more comfortably into the rhythm of daily eating. When a bird did end up in the pot, it might be because it no longer laid well, or because a celebration demanded a visible centerpiece. Chickens were, in that sense, not exactly everyday meat, but they were present, familiar, part of the household economy. Sheep and goats complicate the picture further. In sheep-raising regions, particularly where wool was important, flocks were valuable primarily for what they produced alive. Yet surplus young animals or older ones past their prime were killed and eaten. Mutton, the meat of adult sheep, appears in manorial and urban records. How often it reached the poorest hinges on local arrangements. In some cases, peasants might receive parts of slaughtered animals as part of wages or customary rites. In others, they might sell an animal and rarely, if ever, taste their own flock. Goats, meanwhile, often functioned as the poor man's cow, lighter on the land, flexible in what they would eat, and generous in milk. Their meat was eaten, but they were also investments, and killing one was not a casual decision. Here again, we are in the realm of occasional situational meat, not routine plate-filling portions. When you step back and try to map this across Europe, historians see patterns, but not a single answer. In some relatively prosperous regions where access to woodland, pasture and markets was favourable, peasant households may have eaten small amounts of meat quite regularly, bits of bacon in pottage, an egg here, some offal there, a piece of salt pork on certain days. In harsher or more densely populated areas, where land was tight, animals few, and lords more demanding, meat might have been so infrequent that a truly meaty meal marked a feast day in memory. To that animal landscape we need to add fish, which occupied a slightly different category in medieval thinking, especially under the influence of church fasting rules, but which, from a peasant perspective, was often simply another kind of precious protein. Access again depended on geography and privilege. Villages near coasts, rivers or lakes had obvious opportunities, but even there who could fish when and for what was not always straightforward. Rights to fish in certain rivers or to use particular nets might be jealously guarded by lords, monasteries or towns. In some cases peasants fished unofficially, taking small catches from streams, ponds or shorelines, supplementing their diet quietly. Where the legal and physical access existed, freshwater fish like eels, carp, pike, and smaller species could show up with some regularity. Archaeological deposits of fish bones at rural sites, along with evidence of artificial fish ponds on some estates, hint that fish, especially the more modest kinds, were not unknown on peasant plates. Along coasts, shellfish and small seafish could be gathered or bought relatively cheaply, though exactly who ate how much remains a subject of ongoing study. Preservation extended fish's reach. Drying, salting and smoking turned fresh catches into trade goods. Salted herring and cod in particular moved long distances by the later Middle Ages, and there is evidence that even non-elite consumers in some areas bought or received preserved fish, especially to meet the demands of fast days when meat from warm-blooded animals was restricted. Whether that preserved fish was a grim necessity or a welcome change of flavour likely varied from household to household. The one thing we can be fairly confident about is that wild game, the deer and boar of romantic imagination, belonged, in law and in practice, much more to lords than to peasants. Forests and hunting preserves were tightly regulated. Poaching could be punished harshly. That does not mean peasants never tasted game. Some lords distributed hunted animals as part of patronage or wages, and some hunting certainly slipped past watchful eyes. But the idea of villagers regularly going out to hunt deer for the family table runs squarely against surviving legal records. So where does that leave us? Somewhere in between the two caricatures. Peasants were not feasting on large roasts every night. Their diet was built above all on grain, vegetables and dairy. But nor were they, in all times and places, living on plants alone, staring wistfully at distant herds. Instead, meat and fish threaded through their year in uneven, negotiated ways. Bits and scraps more often than slabs, flavouring more often than centrepiece, common for some households and rare treats for others. The limits of luxury, for them, were not a clean line between meat-eaters and non-meat-eaters, but a shifting boundary drawn by land, law, livestock, season, and sheer luck. Understanding that messy middle prepares us to look, next, at how the turning of the year itself tightened or loosened that boundary, making some weeks unexpectedly rich and others uncomfortably bare. To understand what medieval peasants really ate, you almost have to stop thinking in terms of what's for dinner and start thinking in terms of what month is it. Because for this household, the menu is not a list on a wall. It is a circle on a calendar, drawn in grain and cabbage, in salt and smoke, and slowly emptying bins. Imagine the year rolling forward from the moment that pig is slaughtered in late autumn. This is, in many households, the moment of greatest apparent abundance. The harvest has been brought in and threshed. The Lord's share, tithes and rents have been taken. Yes, but what remains is stacked, bagged, or heaped in storerooms and lofts. Grain stores look full. Beans and peas are dry and safe in sacks. Turnips, parsnips, beets, and cabbages sit in pits or cellars, layered with straw or soil. On racks and hooks, new strings of onions and garlic, bunches of herbs, and, for the luckier, strips of meat hang curing. It is just after this busy, exhausting period of harvest, threshing, and slaughter that the table can feel, briefly, almost generous. Fresh bread from newly milled flour, pottage thick with autumn vegetables, and perhaps a more obvious chunk of pork. Maybe a bit of fresh liver, blood pudding, or crackling from the slaughter, eaten within days because it cannot be stored long. Stronger ale from grain that has just been malted, its flavour a reminder that, at least for now, the household has something to work with. This moment of fullness, though, sits under a quiet, constant calculation. How long must this last? Preserving food was not an optional extra. It was the only way to stretch that narrow window of harvest into the long months when the earth would offer little. Almost every preservation method you can name appears somewhere in medieval rural life, shaped by local resources and traditions. Salting was one of the most important where it could be afforded. Meat was rubbed with dry salt or packed into layers of salt in barrels or tubs. Fish, particularly in coastal or riverine communities, might be packed the same way. Salt drew out moisture, slowed rot, and made these foods safe, if often very salty and in need of soaking before use. But salt itself had to be purchased in many inland regions, sometimes at painful cost. How heavily a peasant household salted its food is therefore a question of local economics, as much as culinary taste. Drying was more widely accessible. Peas, beans, and some fruits could simply be dried in the sun or near the hearth until they kept without moulding. Thin strips of meat or fish, particularly in wind-swept or smoke-rich environments, could be hung until they were leathery and stable. Smoking overlapped with both salting and drying. Hams, sausages, and fish suspended in the smokier parts of a building absorbed compounds that helped preserve them while slowly losing moisture. In some houses, the very architecture, the open hearth, the darkened rafters, tells archaeologists that smoke and food preservation were baked into the structure itself. Fermentation offered another, quieter set of tools. Cabbages and other vegetables could be shredded, salted lightly, and weighted in crocks to sour over weeks. Direct evidence varies by region, but versions of fermented vegetable dishes appear in medieval recipes, and later rural traditions, suggesting that many peasants knew how to turn a glut of one crop into a slowly available resource. Grain became ale, as we've seen. Milk became cheese. Even scraps and byproducts could be transformed. Whey could be used in cooking, sour milk in baking or animal feed, nothing comfortably wasted. And then there was simple, cool darkness and patience. Cellars, pits, and buried jars helped keep roots, apples, and cabbages edible as long as possible. The success of these methods depended on local climate, soil, and luck. A mild winter or poorly dug pit could mean early rot. A cold, stable one could mean the difference between a tolerable march and a desperate one, because inevitably, no matter how carefully things were set aside, the full bins of autumn began to empty. This is where the shape of the year turns. By midwinter, if all had gone moderately well, the household might still be eating relatively comfortably. The truly fresh foods were gone, but there was bread, dried pulses, stored roots, bits of preserved pork or bacon to flavour the pot. The work of the fields slackened in many regions, though not completely. There was still animal care, repair of tools, weaving, spinning tasks that did not care about the weather quite as much. Calorie needs were not insignificant, especially in cold climates, but the hardest outdoor labour often waited for warmer, drier conditions. Yet, as the days began to lengthen, a quiet tension set in. Historians sometimes call this period, roughly from late winter into early spring, the hunger gap. The old supplies were running low. Grain sacks grew visibly lighter. The most vulnerable households might already be cutting their bread thinner, diluting pottage more, choosing between what they ate now and what they needed to hold back for seed. The last softening cabbages, the wrinkled apples, the sprouting onions, these were signs that time was catching up. At the same time, the new growing season demanded more from the body. Ploughing, manuring, sowing spring crops, mending fences, driving animals to pasture. All of this work took strength. In some areas, transhumance, moving animals to different grazing grounds, added to the burden. So you have this uncomfortable overlap. The point in the year when physical labour ramps up, while available calories may be at their thinnest. This is one reason spring, which we tend to romanticize as a time of freshness and plenty, could be genuinely one of the hardest seasons for medieval peasants. The first edible greens, yes, could be a welcome sight. Nettles, sorrel, wild garlic, and early leaves from gardens gave pottage a new brightness, and at least a little vitamin relief after months of dried fare. But they were more like flavour and supplement than like a full solution to the underlying arithmetic. Until new grain could be harvested, until young animals were big enough to slaughter, until gardens truly came into their own, families were still mostly living on what remained of the past year's work. Summer began to shift that balance. As gardens filled out, meals could again hold a visible variety of colour and texture, fresh peas and beans, cabbages, leeks, onions, herbs, sometimes small fruits. Milk production often increased with better pasture, making cheese and butter more available. In some regions, early haymaking, weeding, and other tasks kept the labour calendar full, but people at least had the psychological boost of seeing living food around them again. By late summer and early autumn, as grain ripened and animals fattened, the circle approached its fullest point once more. Yet even at the high point, a careful household was thinking half a year ahead. That extra basket of beans wasn't just today's bounty, it was February's survival. That decision to eat or to preserve was always humming just under the surface. What emerges when you trace this year through food is a diet that cannot be captured honestly by a single snapshot. To ask, what did peasants eat, as if there were one stable answer, is a bit like asking, what is the weather like, without naming a place or a month. The real answer is that they ate bread, pottage, vegetables, dairy, occasional meat and fish, but in constantly shifting proportions, textures and moral weights, depending on where they stood within that yearly cycle. Abundance and scarcity were not permanent states. They were phases you could practically mark on the church calendar or in the fields, special meals clustered around harvest, slaughter, and certain festivals not only because religion said so or custom dictated it, but because that was when there was actually something extra to work with. Thin weeks came predictably too, even in non-famine years, as stores dwindled and new crops had not yet fully arrived, for medieval peasants. Then, the menu was not written on parchment. It was written in the slow turning of seasons, in the level of the grain bin, in the smell of the cheese shelf, in the way the pottage pot grew richer or leaner as the year spun on. Their diet was, in a very literal way, a calendar, and understanding that seasonal rhythm is essential if we want to see what religion, geography, and social hierarchy then did to shape, and sometimes disrupt, that fragile, carefully managed cycle. Yet if the turning of the seasons wrote one calendar on the table, another, equally powerful one was already there, hanging not in the barn or by the grain chest, but in the church, the liturgical year. For our household food choices do not just answer to weather and harvest, they also answer quietly but insistently to saints' days, vigils, feasts and fasts. You can almost imagine two invisible hands adjusting the menu. One is the sky, the other is the church. Medieval Christianity, in both its Western Latin and Eastern Orthodox forms, developed a surprisingly detailed set of rules about what could and could not be eaten on particular days. In broad strokes, many of these rules revolved around abstinence from meat, and in stricter forms from all animal products, eggs, dairy, sometimes even animal fat on certain days, or during particular seasons such as Lent. For a peasant, this did not mean a dramatic, restaurant-style menu change every time a bell rang. It meant a steady background awareness that today's pottage, today's bread, today's cheese might have to be made, or at least served, a little differently. The most famous stretch of this rhythm is Lent, the roughly 40 days before Easter. In theory, this was a time when Christians were to abstain from meat of warm-blooded animals, and, in many regions and periods, from dairy and eggs as well. That is an extraordinary demand if you think about it in the context of a rural household, whose main reliable sources of fat and protein, outside of rare meat, are precisely cheese, butter and eggs. In wealthier homes and monasteries, we see quite clearly from written records how these rules were navigated. Fish appears in huge quantities. Almond milk and other plant-based substitutes stand in for dairy. Elaborate Lenten dishes emerge in which the absence of meat becomes almost a culinary challenge. For peasants, the picture is fuzzier and likely more varied. Where fish was available fresh from rivers, coasts or ponds, it could step into the role meat otherwise played. But fish here could mean eels, freshwater species, even certain aquatic birds in some local interpretations. In inland areas far from easy fisheries, preserved fish, salted, smoked or dried might appear, but its cost and supply depended on trade networks beyond a single village's control. There were also many other fast days scattered through the year beyond Lent. Fridays were commonly days of abstinence from meat, as were the eves of major feasts. In some regions, Wednesdays joined the list. Add in Ember days, Rogation days, and local observances, and you begin to see how a great many ordinary weeks might feature at least 1 or 2 days when meat, in theory, was off the table even if you happened to have some. This did not mean that on non-meat days peasants were staring despairingly at empty bowls. It meant they leaned more heavily on the foods we have already met. Pottage thickened with grain and peas, flavoured with onions, leeks, herbs, and perhaps a little oil if available instead of bacon fat. Bread eaten with plain or salted fish where possible. Ale and, depending on local custom and strictness, perhaps still some dairy, especially in times and places where the prohibition on eggs and milk never fully took hold outside more formal religious settings. And here is where the distance between official rules and lived reality begins to matter. Church councils and clerical writers could, and did, issue stern pronouncements about abstinence. But the ability and willingness of rural families to follow them to the letter depended on many things: local preaching, how watchful priests and lords were, household resources, and simple habit. In some regions, evidence suggests that peasants took Friday abstinence and Lenten restrictions seriously, adapting their cooking accordingly. In others, complaints from clergy about lax observance and rustic ignorance hint that what was supposed to happen on paper did not always fully materialize in the pot. Even where practice was imperfect, though the church's calendar still shaped expectation, you might not eliminate every trace of animal fat from your pottage in Lent, but you knew that this was the time of year when you were supposed to lean away from visible meat. You might not manage to avoid eggs entirely, yet you might sell or save more of them in the lead-up to Easter, when festal baking and celebration demanded plenty. In some places, that very tension between official abstinence and practical need produced creative workarounds. The famous medieval debates about whether beavers or barnacle geese counted as fish because they lived in water or were believed to grow from it are reminders that people were thinking actively about how to live within or just around the rules. On the other side of abstinence lay feasts, and here again religion and appetite met. Major holy days, Christmas, Easter, certain saints especially important to a region or a village often coincided with, or were made to coincide with, moments when a bit of extra food could realistically be mustered, winter festivities when stored meat and ale might be brought out, Easter landing just as spring began to ease the worst of the hunger gap. Liturgical feasts became social and culinary ones, not only because the church encouraged celebration, but because the rhythm of the year allowed, or at least excused, a brief loosening of belts. When a feast day approached, the rules flipped. Where fast days imposed restraint, even if the larder was reasonably stocked, feast days sanctioned, even morally framed, the act of eating better than usual. That extra piece of pork, that richer pottage, that honeyed cake, or special white bread baked from finer flour could be enjoyed not as guilty indulgence, but as a rightful part of honouring a holy day. For a peasant family, that kind of permission mattered. In a world where every mouthful of preserved meat had to be weighed against weeks or months of need, the church did not only take away, it also, at set times, told you that sharing, eating, even a kind of structured extravagance, was correct. Over the course of a year. Then, the table was not simply seasonal, it was also devotional. Mondays and Thursdays might look much like any other day, dictated mostly by what the garden and storeroom allowed. Fridays and Lenten weeks leaned toward the leaner side, whether rigorously or loosely observed. High feasts and local festivals, clustered in particular parts of the year, punctuated that pattern with sanctioned richness. Even in households where obedience was partial, the vocabulary of fast and feast, of meat days and fish days, gave people a shared way of thinking about food, morality, and time. If the grain bin and the weather told peasants what they could eat, the church calendar often told them what they ought to eat, or at least what they ought not to. The result was a diet whose ups and downs were measured not only by harvest and hunger, but also by Advent and Easter, by Fridays and feast days a second, sacred timetable layered directly onto the pottage pot and the bread on the table. If the church calendar laid one set of rules over the medieval table, geography laid down another, even more fundamental one. Our household, the one we have been following, could be in England or northern France or parts of the Empire, and much of what we have described, bread, pottage, ale, cheese, would fit comfortably there. But if we pick up that cottage and drop it, imaginatively, into Tuscany, or a village in Castile, or a fishing town on the Baltic, the basic outlines of peasant life remain, yet the food itself begins to look and taste different. Historians sometimes speak casually of the medieval peasant diet, as though it were a single unified thing. In reality, medieval peasants is a category so broad it covers people from the Irish west coast to the plains of Hungary, from the forests of Scandinavia to the terraced hillsides of Liguria. The tools they used, the social constraints they faced, the religious framework they lived in may have overlapped, but their plates were not identical. Take, for a start, the old north-south divide that runs through so much of European food history. In broad terms, northern and western regions lean toward a pattern built on grains like barley, oats, and later rye, combined with dairy products and, where possible, animal fats. In Mediterranean regions, the classic trio of bread, wine and oil anchored by wheat and olives defines much of the landscape, with legumes, beans, chickpeas, lentils playing a central role. Our northern peasant, tilling a heavier, cooler soil, might eat bread that is dark and dense, made from a mix of rye, barley or oats, with wheat appearing primarily in the bread of the well-off or as a rare treat. Their pottage is thickened with these same grains, flavoured with leeks, cabbage, peas and beans, enriched when possible with bacon or lard. Milk from cows, goats or sheep is turned into cheese and butter. Animal fat becomes a key cooking medium, providing both calories and flavour in a climate where staying warm is a practical concern. Shift southward across the Alps, and the grain itself starts to change. In large swathes of Italy, southern France, and Iberia, wheat holds a more secure place as the preferred bread grain, at least in well-watered or well-managed lands. A peasant's bread is still often coarse, still sometimes mixed with other grains depending on harvests. But the cultural weight of wheat is heavier. Olive oil, where olives can be grown, takes on roles that butter and lard fill further north. Instead of smearing animal fat on bread or stirring it into pottage, a household might drizzle a little oil over lentils or chickpeas, or use it to fry or dress vegetables when they can spare it. Legumes form a quiet backbone on both sides of this divide, but they show up differently. In the north, peas and broad beans are major field crops, dried for winter and stirred into pottage as hearty, starchy bulk. In the Mediterranean, chickpeas, lentils and beans may be central to stews that sit closer to what we might imagine as a separate dish, rather than just what happens to be in the pot. Garlic and herbs take on stronger roles in flavouring. Regional greens, from wild chicories to cultivated leafy vegetables, help build a cuisine that later observers would recognise as distinctly southern. Underneath those broad patterns lies the blunt fact of climate and soil. Cool, damp northern fields, with heavier earth favour certain grains and root vegetables. Drier, sunnier slopes make olives and vines possible, but can make lush pastures harder to maintain. Where the soil is thin and rocky, sheep and goats thrive. Where it is deep and rich, cattle become more practical. Those choices about which animals to keep ripple through the diet. More sheep and goats mean more of their milk in cheeses. More cattle, when they can be fed, mean different dairy patterns and different possibilities for meat. Water also matters, not just from the sky, but from the sea and rivers. A village with direct access to the North Sea, the Baltic, the Bay of Biscay, or the Mediterranean has, in theory, a line to fish that an inland hill community simply does not. For coastal peasants, fish might be a familiar part of the diet, woven into ordinary days as much as into church-prescribed fasts. Eels trapped in marshes, herring taken in seasonal abundance, small coastal fish cooked fresh or dried and smoked for later. These are not luxuries, but local staples. Move inland a few days' travel, and fish becomes something else. It may still appear on peasant tables, especially along big river systems like the Rhine or the Danube, but preserved fish, salted, smoked, dried, now has to move along trade routes. Salt itself, crucial for curing and for simple seasoning, follows similar paths. Villages near salt pans or salt springs might have easier access, while others pay dearly for every pinch. That cost shapes how much meat can be preserved, how heavily foods are seasoned, even whether certain fasting practices are realistically sustainable away from the coasts and major trade arteries. Because of all this, it is misleading to speak about the medieval English peasant, and imagine the same dinner in Cornwall and in East Anglia, let alone to assume that an English, French, German, Italian, or Iberian peasant all ate some interchangeable medieval mush. Even within a single kingdom, the diet of a vine-growing valley might differ markedly from that of a grain-heavy plateau or a forested upland. In parts of Eastern Europe, where steppe and forest met, millet and later buckwheat might play larger roles. Orthodox fasting rules could push diets in directions slightly different from their Latin Western neighbours, especially on particular days. What ties these diverse tables together is less any one specific food and more a shared logic. People eat what the land, the climate, and their social position allow. Wheat where it grows reliably, rye or barley where it does not. Butter where cows can be fed, oil where olives will bear. Fish where water is close, dried and salted substitutes where it is not. The rhythms of pottage and bread, feast and fast still exist, but they are filled in with different colours and flavours. So when we say medieval peasant food, we are really talking about a family resemblance among many local cuisines, not a single uniform menu. A Tuscan sharecropper and a Yorkshire copyholder would both recognise the hard work behind each other's meals, but the tastes on their tongues, the fats that shone on their bread, the grains in their porridge, and the fish, or lack of it in their pots, would remind us that medieval Europe was never one village, one climate, or one table. For all this talk of limits and careful management, there were days when that pattern broke, when the table was suddenly, almost shockingly, generous. To understand peasant food honestly, you have to make room for these interruptions. The feast days, the weddings, the great harvest meals when, briefly, the rules bent. Imagine our household not on an ordinary Tuesday, but on the evening after the grain has finally come in. The last cart has creaked into the yard. The sheaves are stacked, tools are put away. Harvest was one of the most dangerous, exhausting stretches of the agricultural year, and also one of the moments when more food was physically present in one place than at almost any other time. In many villages, custom and expectation demanded that lords mark this moment with something extra, a cask of ale opened for the workers, a slaughtered animal shared out, bread from manorial ovens distributed as part of the obligations that bound land and labour together. This didn't mean every harvest turned into a lavish banquet. In some years, what people mostly felt was relief that there was any grain at all. But where yields were decent and relationships between lord and tenants not completely poisoned, there is evidence of what some historians call harvest hospitality. Manorial accounts from various parts of Europe record allowances of bread and ale for reapers, occasional distributions of cheese or meat, even small cash payments that could, at least briefly, be turned into extra food. In an ordinary year, a peasant might go weeks without more than a scrap of fresh meat. At harvest's end, a whole village might share roasted beef, mutton, or pork, however modest the portion each person actually received. Then there were weddings. A peasant wedding was not just a private family matter, it was a community event, and the food reflected that. Marriages tied together households, consolidated or reshuffled rights to land, and in many places required formal recognition from lord or priest. It was worth marking. The form varied widely region to region, but surviving records from court documents to later folkloric accounts suggest some common threads. A bride ale or wedding ale brewed specially, neighbours contributing bread or small amounts of food, a pig or a sheep fattened for months with this day in mind, then finally slaughtered. For the families involved, this might be the most elaborate meal they would ever host. That did not automatically mean abundance in a modern sense, mountains of food without end, but it did mean intentional excess by their usual standards. More people invited than could comfortably fit in the cottage. More ale drawn and drunk in a day than might otherwise be consumed in a week. Dishes that used up hoarded resources. White bread, if they could manage wheat. Richer pottages with eggs stirred in, pastries, or simple cakes sweetened with honey when available. In such moments, the usual rule of stretching every ingredient as far as possible gave way, at least temporarily, to a different rule. It should not be said that the wedding of so-and-so was stingy. Honour, reputation, and sheer joy all argued in favour of generosity, and families might willingly run down reserves, trusting that the community and the next season would in some measure help them rebuild. The church calendar also carved out islands of relative abundance, sitting curiously alongside its many fasts. Major feast days, the patron saint of the village, Christmas, Easter. Certain important Marian feasts were not just liturgical events but social and culinary ones. Even under fasting rules, feast days could involve multiple courses at elite tables. At peasant ones, they more often meant that something special appeared, a better cut of meat, if the rules allowed, fish where usually there was none, sweetened dishes, spiced ale, extra bread handed out as alms. Monasteries and urban fraternities played quiet roles here. Monastic houses, especially those with local ties, might distribute food to the poor on certain feasts as part of their devotional obligations. These could be simple bread and pottage, or on particular days portions of fish or meat. Guilds and lay religious brotherhoods in towns sometimes hosted communal meals for their members on saints' days, and while peasants on the countryside margins did not automatically belong to such groups, the broader pattern is revealing. Religious celebration and unusual eating went hand in hand. Even purely local customs could open small windows of abundance. In some places there were killing times in late autumn, when pigs were slaughtered and preserved. On that day, before the meat was salted, smoked, or turned into sausages, fresh cuts were often cooked at once and shared. Neighbours came to help with the work and were fed in return. Children, who might only ever know bacon as a thin, precious flavouring in pottage, might taste, once a year, roast pork hot from the spit. Carnival periods in late winter, in regions that observed them, show the same logic in reverse. With the long Lenten fast approaching, households used up animal fats, eggs and dairy that either would not keep or would be forbidden for weeks. Pancakes, donuts, rich pastries, and egg-heavy dishes appear in later recipes and descriptions. For peasants, the principle was similar even if the specific foods were humbler. You ate the things that could not or should not be saved. The result was a brief, noisy spike in richness before a scheduled return to restraint. These moments matter when we try to understand medieval peasant diets, because they push back against the idea of a life made only of monotony and grey sameness. Yes, most days were practical and restrained, built on familiar staples. But layered over that was a rhythm of scarcity and celebration, of lean weeks, followed by evenings when the ale flowed more freely and the pot held more than usual. At the same time, it would be misleading to imagine that feasts erased the hard edges of life. A single generous wedding meal did not change the reality of next month's rent, tithes, or the uncertainty of the next harvest. In some cases, the very cost of providing hospitality could deepen a family's vulnerability if the following year turned bad. What these occasions did offer, reliably, was something more intangible, a sense that life contained not only work and calculation, but also days when the normal rules relaxed, when the village ate, drank, and remembered itself as a community. Put against the myth of the perpetually half-starved peasant, these scenes complicate the picture. They show that medieval rural life included real pleasure in eating, not just in the rare taste of meat or sweetness, but in the act of sharing it, that lords and monasteries, however exploitative in other ways, sometimes participated in this economy of occasional generosity, and that memory itself, for the people who lived it, may have been punctuated not only by years of hunger, but by the bright, specific recollection of that harvest, that wedding, that saint's day when there was more than enough. If feast days and weddings show us the bright peaks of medieval eating, we also have to look directly at the valleys, because they were just as real and, for some people, far more defining. So far, the household we've been following has had, mostly, what historians sometimes call precarious sufficiency. Life is narrow, but it works. The pot keeps going. The garden produces enough. Rent is paid. Tithes are met. And while no one is eating lavishly, they are, for the most part, eating. That balance could be shattered with remarkable speed. A run of bad weather could do it, too much rain when grain needed to ripen, or too little when seedlings were trying to take hold. A late frost that killed blossoms, a storm that flattened fields right before harvest. War could do it as armies, whether foreign invaders or the Lord's own forces, moved through the countryside, taking grain, trampling crops, seizing animals, sometimes burning stored food outright as part of a scorched earth strategy. Disease could do it less directly, but just as severely, by killing draft animals that ploughed fields or family members whose labour the household depended on to sow, weed, reap and process what they grew. When people talk about medieval famine, they sometimes imagine a single dramatic event, like the Great Famine of the early 14th century, which did indeed cover much of northern Europe and left a paper trail in chronicles and official records. But for many peasants, the sharper pain was often not in those headline years, terrible though they were, but in the quieter failures. The harvest that was just poor enough that the family went into winter already worried. The second bad year in a row, when the margin that had carried them through the first was simply gone. In those moments, inequality stopped being an abstract fact and became something you could taste or not taste every day. The poorest households broke first. These were the people with the least land, or land of the poorest quality. The ones already in debt, already renting out their own labour at the hardest times of year. The widows and orphans without a full set of working hands. The families recently hit by illness. They had fewer reserves in their bins and chests, fewer animals that could be slaughtered if it came to that, fewer relatives in a position to lend grain or share food. When grain runs low, you do not leap immediately to total starvation. You stretch, you substitute, you lower your expectations, often in stages so gradual that for a time it feels like you're managing. More bran and chaff goes into the bread, making loaves darker, denser, sometimes barely held together. Grain that would normally be saved for seed might be ground and eaten instead, a decision that solves today's hunger at the expense of next year's planting. Pottage becomes thinner and more dominated by whatever the household can gather from outside its own fields and garden. Wild greens and herbs, roots that are technically edible but not usually preferred, acorns and chestnuts in some regions, carefully leached of tannins and worked into something like flour. Foraging, which in better years might be a supplement, a way to add variety and flavour, becomes, in lean ones, a survival strategy. People go further from home more often, looking for nuts, berries, fungi, any plant whose edibility they know from long local tradition. The knowledge here is impressive, and it's easy, from a modern perspective, to admire it, to speak in terms of resilience and resourcefulness. But it's worth pausing to remember what pushed that knowledge so hard. The sharp, simple fact that not having something in the pot meant going to bed hungry. There were more desperate substitutions too, some of which show up in later moralizing sources as warnings. Bark stripped from trees and ground, then mixed with whatever grain remained, could bulk out bread while making it almost inedible by normal standards. Straw and other inedible plant material might be chopped fine and stirred into pottage, simply to give it more apparent substance. In extreme cases, historians and contemporaries alike describe people eating cats, dogs, carrion, even in a few of the worst documented famines, flesh taken from the dead. It can be hard to know, source by source, where description ends and horror story exaggeration begins, but even allowing for some rhetorical excess, the line being drawn is very clear. Under enough pressure, the normal rules about what counted as food could break. Before conditions reached that point, most communities tried to buffer the blow. Lords, who wanted their rents paid in the long term, had an interest in not allowing all their tenants to simply starve. Manorial granaries, where they existed, might release grain on credit to be repaid in future good years. Village elites who had surplus sometimes lent, either informally or through arrangements recorded later in court records. Parish priests and monasteries could distribute alms, bread, pottage, sometimes fish or meat on particular days, or allow the poor to glean after harvest, collecting leftover ears of grain from the fields. These measures did not operate in a world of charitable innocence. Grain loaned had to be repaid, often with interest, and could tighten the long-term hold of a landlord over a struggling household. Allowances and remissions were uneven and depended on the character and calculations of particular lords, abbots, or officials. Famine and near famine, again and again, widened the gap between those with some cushion and those with none at all. Even within a single village, the experience of a bad year was not uniform. One family might ride it out by slaughtering an extra pig and using up stores they had been able to accumulate. Another, already close to the edge, might see their small patch of land effectively swallowed up as they sold or mortgaged rights just to get through the winter. The same weather, the same failed harvest, could mean lean months for one household and permanent descent into landless poverty for their neighbours. All of this sits uneasily alongside the picture of everyday competence we've spent so much time with, but it belongs to the same story. The skills that kept the pot going, that made decent bread from mediocre grain, that managed gardens and livestock with such care, were never a guarantee. They were strategies in a world where security was always conditional. It can be tempting, from a distance, to dwell on the ingenuity, the foraging, the substitutions, the neighbourly sharing. Those things were real, and many people are alive across generations, because they worked at least partly, at least sometimes. But to stop there, at the celebration of resilience, is to look away from the harder truth the medieval sources, quietly but insistently, keep pointing at, that for every household that managed to bend without breaking, there were others for whom a run of bad years meant selling tools, losing land, sending children out as servants, or simply not surviving. To understand what medieval peasants really ate then, you have to hold both realities at once. The ordinary days when skill and custom made enough from very little, and the extraordinary, terrifying stretches when even the best managed household could find its table steadily, inexorably emptying. We've now seen both ends of the spectrum, the days when the pot is comfortably full, and the terrifying stretches when it is not. To bring all of that together, it's worth pausing and asking a deceptively simple question. If you could sit down at a peasant table on an ordinary day, what would actually be in front of you? What follows isn't a single correct menu. There was no one medieval peasant meal any more than there is one single modern dinner. But using manorial records, household accounts, archaeological finds, and the patterns we've already traced, we can sketch several plausible tables. Think of these not as firm rules, but as well-grounded reconstructions, meals that could have happened, and probably did, again and again in countless variations. Begin with a reasonably fortunate small-holding family in a middling year, somewhere in northern Europe, in late summer or early autumn, just before the worst of winter scarcity, just after gardens and fields have briefly been generous. The day begins early with what many sources simply call bread and drink, The father and older children are heading to the fields. On the table, thick slices of yesterday's coarse rye and barley loaf, maybe spread with a little fresh cheese or a scrape of butter, if the cow or goats are giving well. A wooden cup of small ale for each person, cool and faintly sour. The youngest children might get a bit of warmed pottage from the pot by the hearth, thinned with milk if there is any to spare. Midday work pauses. No one comes home this time. They eat where they are, from a cloth bundle. More bread, a small wedge of hard, sharp cheese, perhaps a piece of cold pottage set firm overnight, cut like a slice of thick porridge. If the household was able to kill a pig in the spring and cure it properly, there might be a few precious shavings of bacon, mostly for flavour on the bread, rather than as a separate course. Again, ale to drink, carried out from the house in a jug earlier that morning. The main meal, taken in the later afternoon or early evening, is where the day's food really gathers. On the board, a pot of pottage, thick and fragrant, built on oats or barley, bulked out with beans and peas from the garden, studded with chopped leeks and onions, coloured deep green with late summer herbs, maybe a few cabbage leaves toward the end. A small bone from that same pig, or a scrap of salt pork, has been simmering in it, not enough to provide big chunks of meat for everyone, but enough to scent the whole dish with fat and smoke. More bread, now fresh from the communal oven, if it was the household's baking day, or simply the same dark loaf continued from the morning. Maybe, if the garden did well, a small side of raw or lightly cooked vegetables, sliced radishes, or a rough salad of whatever leaves are available, dressed simply with salt and a bit of oil if the region uses it, or nothing at all. Nothing about this is luxurious, but it is varied. Grain, vegetables, pulses, a little animal fat, fermented drink, a practical filling meal built from overlapping strategies, not just a bowl of anonymous grey mush. Shift the scene. Same family, but now it is late winter in a year that has been merely adequate, not disastrous. The difference on the table is immediate. The morning's bread is darker and denser, with more bran and perhaps a mix of less valued grains. The cheese is older, harder, maybe starting to crack at the edges. The butter, if there is any, is salted and rationed carefully. The midday bundle is smaller, bread, maybe a little onion or a clove of garlic, a piece of that sharp cheese, and not much else. The evening pottage is thinner now, leaning harder on dried peas and beans and whatever is left of stored cabbages and onions. The herbs are mostly dried, their flavour faint. The meat bone that enriched the summer version may have been boiled so many times that it contributes more memory than fat. No fresh greens yet, unless someone has foraged the earliest wild leaves. This is still a functioning diet, but the variety has narrowed and the margin has shrunk. Now compare that to a poorer household in the same village, a cottar with very little land, perhaps only a garden patch and rights to keep a few animals on common pasture. On a decent summer day, their table might hold bread made more from oats or barley than wheat, maybe bought as part of their labour arrangements, rather than baked from their own grain. Their pottage could be rich in garden vegetables, because even a small plot, well tended, can produce plenty of greens and beans. But the animal products are thinner, less cheese, less butter, fewer scraps of bacon to toss into the pot. Their calories come more directly from grain and legumes, their flavour more from onions and herbs than from meat. On a bad winter, when work is scarce and rent still due, that same household might find their meals collapsing toward the very bottom of the spectrum we talked about earlier. Bread stretched with whatever could be mixed into the dough, pottage made mostly from dried peas, wild greens and the last tired roots from the garden, with no fat to soften its edges. This too is a real peasant meal, as historically grounded as the more comfortable smallholder's table. Not every contrast is about wealth alone. Regional differences mattered. Imagine a peasant family in a dairy-rich upland region where cows or sheep thrive more easily than grain. Their bread might be sparser, depending more heavily on imported or locally grown oats and barley, but their table could see more cheese as a daily staple, more butter for cooking, more buttermilk to drink, pottage. In that cottage might be lighter on meat, but richer in dairy, a broth thickened with whey, a dish of boiled grains finished with a ladle of milk when supplies allow. The specifics here are more speculative, because sources are patchier for some regions than others, but charred residues and local account books do point to real variations like this. Set all of these ordinary days next to a feast in a relatively good year, and the contrast sharpens after harvest, or on a major church holiday when work pauses and the village gathers. That same small holding household might sit down to something that feels almost lavish by their standards. White bread made from better, more finely sifted flour, at least for the head of the house and honoured guests. A pottage enriched not just with bones but with actual chunks of fresh pork or mutton, eggs, boiled or baked into a simple dish. Perhaps a honey-sweetened pudding of grain or milk, and, if the community has pooled resources, a roast joint of meat carved out and shared. The ale that day might be stronger, the cups refilled more often. No one mistakes this for their new normal. Part of the pleasure is precisely that it is rare. Across all these tables, what stands out isn't a single defining dish, but a pattern. Peasant meals were built from what was at hand, the grain they could grow or afford, the vegetables their soil and climate favoured, the milk their animals produced, the scraps they could preserve and rework. Constraint shaped every choice. But within those constraints there was real variation, real strategy, and in better years, real satisfaction. So, when we picture what a peasant meal looked like, the honest answer isn't a single sad bowl, but a shifting range of possibilities, sometimes thin, sometimes hearty, sometimes brightened by cheese or meat, or an extra loaf of better bread, always tethered to season, region, and household fortune. Across all of those imagined tables, from the decent harvest year to the scraping by winter, one thing should be clear by now. The story is more complicated than they had nothing but a crust of bread and a bowl of grey slop. Grain was central, yes. Pottage was common, yes. There were real hard years and real hunger. But there was also cabbage and leeks, beans and peas, cheese and buttermilk, herbs and occasional meat, and an entire toolkit of preservation and stretching that kept many families hovering just above the edge of disaster most of the time, rather than plunging into it every day. So why, given the evidence, does the thinner, bleaker picture still feel so familiar? Part of the answer lies in where our stories come from. For a long time, most written records were created by people looking down the social ladder, landlords, clergy, visiting officials later on, moralizing reformers and nostalgic romantics. When they mentioned peasants' food at all, it was often to make a point. A sparse meal could serve as a symbol of humble virtue, or of how hard the poor had it, or of how generous a patron was by comparison. Coarse bread and gruel became a shorthand, not a careful description. Then, much later, came popular culture. If you're staging a film, a series, or a game, and you need to convey medieval poverty in a single shot, a dim room, and a sad bowl on the table do that job instantly. No one has to explain it. A thick, interesting pottage full of beans and herbs, or a table with dark bread, cheese, and a jug of ale, looks almost too familiar, too much like ordinary rustic food anywhere. The stereotype is visually efficient, so it keeps being reused. There is also the way we tend to think about the past in general. It is tempting to flatten it into extremes, either a golden age of hearty, honest fare, straight from the land, or an age of universal misery. Nuance is harder to remember than an image of a starving peasant gnawing crusts in the snow. Famine years were real and devastating, and they left deep marks in chronicles and in collective memory. The quieter, more ordinary years when people got by on adequate, if monotonous, diets left fewer dramatic stories. What the evidence suggests instead is a balance that doesn't fit cleanly into either myth. Medieval peasant diets were varied within a narrow band, lots of repetition, lots of grain, but also real diversity across the year and from region to region, and a constant awareness of risk. People were not perpetually on the brink of collapse, nor were they secretly feasting in comfort. They were managing, improvising, nudging their households through cycles of scarcity and relative ease, one loaf and one pot at a time. If you carry one framework away from this, let it be this. When you imagine medieval daily life, think in terms of systems rather than single snapshots. Think of fields, gardens, animals, and stored food working together. Think of seasons tightening and loosening the belt. Think of women and men who knew intimately what each week's meals would cost in labour and in risk. Within that web, a bowl of pottage or a slice of bread stops being a cliché and becomes a clue. If you found this journey through the medieval kitchen useful, consider leaving a like. It helps more people find the video. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from, and what surprised you most about what peasants really ate? And if you'd like to explore more nights in other forgotten households and periods, you can subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.